Good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year. Um, so this is the session on tips for leading an inclusive organization. A little bit of housekeeping and intros. First up, you have two main co-presenters to this on this session. My name is Brian Hara. I use he or they pronouns, and I'm part of the team within OIIE, known as Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, or DEI Education. I'm going to pass it off to my co-host.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adrian Battle-Marston, and I use he, him, his pronouns. I am also a part of DEI Education.
So this session, first, we'll give you the spoiler alert. The last slide is a QR code to give you the slides. So you're welcome to take notes, but know that in about half an hour, you're going to have a QR code that gives you these slides, actually these slides and more. So we want to make sure you have all the resources as you have all these great sessions today. So Adrian and I are going to take turns. We invite you to, as always, use the chat, and we'll take turns keeping our eyes open as we share the presentation for today. Our main goal is to kind of do a refresher. We've made such great momentum to you when it comes to these terms, D, E, and I, and we'll do kind of a quick recap, but we want to really hone in on some useful skills, particularly if you are a current or aspirational or rising officer in one or more orgs. And we also want to make room for particular questions, which is why we want to welcome using the chat. And we're happy to take breaks and have conversation. For now, we seem to be a small group, so we have plenty of time to sort of chat. And if you have particular questions, do not hesitate to use the chat. And there may be a couple of breaks where we can leave the slides and show faces, if that would be helpful. So it's really about additional skills and resources. So first up, I'm going to pass it back to Adrian for the quick refresher that we just talked about.
Thanks, Brian. So as we mentioned, we've got a couple of key concepts here that we'd love for you all to just be somewhat reminded of. And you're probably familiar with some of these terms. Some of them you may define a little bit differently, but we just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to the way that we sort of define these here in our context of Towson University. So the first one is diversity, and that can really just sort of be summarized as, in a generic way, variety or difference. And we describe the second term, which we call equity, which is fairness in access, treatment, and opportunity. And oftentimes people can essentially associate the term equity with equality, and we'll get a little bit more into the difference later on in our presentation, but we do want to just say straight off the bat, we do not define equity as the same thing as equality. And we'll get some time to really unpack what we mean by that later on. And last but not least, our third definition is what we define as inclusion. And that essentially is our opportunity to sincerely invite in the active participation and contributions of everyone. And while we may have diversity in a lot of instances, like on our campus, that doesn't always guarantee inclusion. When we look at inclusion, we see this as an opportunity for striving all three. And what that looks like is what we sort of see as the center of these three here, where we are able to create a sense of belonging, where everyone essentially feels valued and integrated. And so as we sort of continue to look at some of these terms, we want to point your attention to the screen as we look at some of these numbers and what that might tell us about some of the work that we've been a part of and how they connect to the terms that we just presented on not too long ago. If you all can sort of look at where we were in the spring of 2020, we had about 49.1% students of color, while having about roughly 51% white students. Now, if we were to jump all the way up to the fall of last semester, fall 2020, we can see a pretty significant change here, about 56% students of color and about 44.2. Now, we may look at that and see these are just maybe a 5 or 6 point differential here. But let's say you were to walk around the Union in the fall of 2022, you can sort of see a difference in who's present on our campus. And so that really informs us and encourages us to ask that question of what does it look like to have an inclusive campus when we are trying to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. The first thing that we can look to is when we consider the idea of what diversity means. We just looked at a graph where we had somewhat of a racial and ethnic breakup and breakdown in terms of data and percentage of who's at our campus. But what we would encourage you all to do is to consider how complex diversity can be. While we may include things like race and racial identity, there are a plethora of other things that we believe are important for us to consider when we want to have this conversation. So for example, if you were to look at some of those, we can just quickly go back here, Ryan, at some of those examples of things like body size, ethnicity, food security, housing, pregnancy, political affiliation, all of those things play a role in when we describe something as diverse. And it's important for us to consider all of those things when we take on the responsibilities such as you all have when it comes to interacting with other students. So as we sort of mentioned earlier on, when it comes to the idea of diversity, it does not guarantee inclusion. In many instances, we can simply look to diversity as numbers and data. We've got people in the room, but now once we've got them there, what does it mean to make sure everyone feels included? And as we can sort of look through some of the pictures that we'll see sort of come up here, we are in an instance where if we were to look at this first one particular example that may come up if we're not considering inclusion is that we get exclusion, right? There's people on the inside, but they're not really being inviting to those on the outside. And that can look in a number of ways with community, resources, and so on and so forth. As you sort of move along here, there are some other examples of some scenarios that you may show up on our campus in larger or even smaller settings, such as a classroom, is, well, maybe there's some segregation here. And these silos are sort of built because there is a lack of community being present here, a lack of representation, or even a lack of resources that are given to the people that need them. The third one is what we would call integration, where we're making some progress here, but we're still not allowing everyone to feel as included in a particular community as we would potentially like. And while we're making progress, our end goal here is this last slide, which is what we would say inclusion. We sort of defined those things earlier on. And it's important for us to look at a lot of these 4 photos here, because at any particular instance, you may find yourselves either being a part of or witnessing a situation or a community where you may find yourselves landing on one of these different locations. And so the question that we would want to impose on you all is, what does it look like to consider where you're landing in our goal of inclusion? Another thing that's important for us to consider is when we think about the idea of identities. What do we mean by that? Well, if we were to look at some of these examples here on this graph, there are a few things that everyone possesses. Earlier on in the presentation, we looked at a few examples of what diversity could look like. And we mentioned things like someone's race, their age, their nationality, their language, their food security, if they worked in the military, if they have housing security, all of those different things. It's important for us to consider the ones that we have because it plays a role in not just how we see ourselves, but how the people around us will end up interacting with us. And in some instances, moments where we may not even recognize it. So if we were to look at the example here that we've got here on the slide, this particular individual has a number of social identities that they prioritize. And while we're sort of paying attention to the ones you've got here, I want us to look at some of the questions that are going to be popping up. The first one we have here is, which do you think about the most? And if we were to take this example here, we can clearly see that this individual is considering their race, their gender, and sexual identity as the most prominent identities that they think about often. And sometimes that could be due to them having pride in those identities, but sometimes that can also look like a situation where they're being constantly reminded of them against their own will through a plethora of examples. The second one is about, which do you think about the least? If we were to again look at this example, we see some things here with religion, social class, and ability, and that can bring up a number of questions like, are there some blind spots that we have because we don't have to consider some of the problems that may arise if someone were to hold on to these social identities? And the last two questions would be, which one would you like to learn more about? And the last one is, which do you feel would influence your role as a student leader the most? These are important questions that we have to keep asking ourselves because they will ultimately play a role in the kind of engagement you have, kind of community you can build, the kind of recruitment you want to participate in. It's important for us to consider those things because they play a very prominent role in every person's everyday life.
And as we sort of take a pause and we're going to shift gears to the next section, we would love and we would welcome anyone to use the chat to tackle that fourth question. We're really curious as you spend part of your day in this student org summit for you, and there's no correct answer. It's really a chance for you to share if you're comfortable. Which of your many identities do you think influence your role as a member of, as a leader of, as eventually some of you may already be or hope to be an e-board member, as a student leader for now, for you personally, which one of your identities do you think influences your role as a student org member or student leader the most? So if you're willing, we'd love to have some contributions in the chat. They're already starting to show up. Thank you. I'm checking the time. We are good on time. So I'm going to take a quick break away from the slides so we can welcome some faces if you're willing. Malia, thank you for going first. You shared both race and religion. Any more contributions in the chat? Or if you'd love to do your Zoom hand and come off mic, we would love to hear from anybody. Tony, go ahead.
Hello. I think for my club, it would have to do with like age, and I believe it said social. Was it social class on there? Yeah, I think those are important. I'm the president for the TU K-pop dance club, and I definitely think age is a part of that, with it just this being like something that's blowing over, especially like blowing up, that's the better phrase, in like the last 5 years or so. And I don't know, I guess like social class, I couldn't really think of any other one, so I just thought, oh, maybe social class. I mean, maybe because like, I don't know, I can't think of anything. Maybe because I like have like access to be able to look at these things more so. Like, I mean, it's not that difficult to access, but that's the only reason I can think of. But I think mostly age out of that whole bracket. Yeah.
And that works. And I just want to mark that so far from the folks who have shared, I appreciate that folks are using more than one answer. Yeah. That's the reality of who we are. And also this idea of, I think it feels like that's part of what we're hoping for, this kind of reflection. And if we were to have this discussion 2 months from now, everyone's answer might very well be different, or it could be the same. I mean, that's sort of the beauty of the last two slides that Adrian went through. Diversity is complex and identities are complicated. We're welcoming in this brief session today, what are the ways that we have seen that showing up in our orgs, or are there particular questions or experiences or even challenges that you all as org members and org leaders have seen? So we're perfectly on track for where we were hoping to go in this session. Any other thoughts, either in the chat or folks who want to come off mic and share?
I can share, even though I put mine in the chat. I
Thank
put race because I am the president of Sister Scripters, which is for Black women in technology. Well, Black women and men now in technology. But I also said religion because I feel like since I'm a Christian, the way that I lead things is affected by my religion. So yeah.
And so, Malia, if you're willing, a question. It sounds like the org isn't officially talking about religion, and yet you're saying it might very well influence how you show up in that org. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. It's not about religion at all, but that's just how, yeah, exactly what you said. Exactly.
We just appreciate that kind of reflection because
Yeah.
it may not be in the title or in the mission or in the Constitution, and yet the willingness to acknowledge it might still be at play here for me or for other members of the org. That's that kind of reflection that we really hope that all student leaders are willing to do on a regular basis. Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts before we get back into our content? Okay, I'm going to take over the next section, and Adrian will monitor the chat. So, having had our sort of refresher reminder about the terms DE and I, we want to kind of go deeper. We want to offer, particularly for student leaders, a way to think as you get comfortable and you comprehend diversity and equity inclusion are related, but not the same terms. We want to invite you to think about ways to reframe how you approach your work at TU. And we sort of do it through a series of questions. We want to kind of offer two different perspectives. One that's grounded in diversity and inclusion primarily, and a separate perspective that's grounded in equity and justice. The big asterisk, literal asterisk on the front on the slide, we're assuming all good intentions here. We're just offering an additional way to reframe your role as members of student org. So for example, a well-intended question grounded in diversity and inclusion might be something like, who's in the room or who's at the table? And that could be a literal table or figurative table. Who's in the e-board, for example. That is a well-intended question grounded in diversity and inclusion, wanting to know who is here and who isn't here. Another way to think about it, an additional way or a nuanced way to think about it that's prioritizing equity and justice, the question might be something like, who's trying to gain access but can't? Whose presence is still under constant threat of erasure, even in 2023? I almost said 2022, but it's a new year. So that's one example of just reimagining. We're not saying it's good and bad. We're saying it's a well-intended question focused on diversity and inclusion, and separately, a well-intended question where the focus shifts to equity and justice. So we're going to run through a few other samples of that difference of perspective. Another great question, grounded in D&I. Have everyone's ideas been heard? That's such a common, great question that a member of an org will ask to make sure that everyone who has a contribution is able to make it. That's great. And if you're also interested, for example, in prioritizing separately equity and justice, the question might also be whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the current majority. So it's not an either or. Think of it as maybe a both and. It's adding another sort of tool bag of tools, particularly for y'all as emerging and current student leaders. Another sample, how many more of a particular group do we have this year rather than last year? That's a great question if you're really focused on diversity. We shared the slide that shows the consistent growth when it comes to undergrad students and race ethnicity, and how often the Towson rightfully take pride in an increasingly diverse student body. Another valuable question that's focused also on equity and justice might be framed as, what are the conditions that we, so here we're going to put ourselves make ourselves accountable. What conditions have we created that are maintaining certain groups as the majority and certain groups in the minority here? That's a more provocative question. It really asks all of us to be accountable. It acknowledges that all of us are works in progress, but it really challenges us to think both about diversity, inclusion, and about equity and justice. Another example, is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? That's such an important question, prioritizing diversity and inclusion. And the slide that Adrian pointed to earlier for us, this idea of belonging. Another separately framed question could be, whose safety is still being minimized to allow others to be comfortable maintaining dehumanizing views? As you saw on the open session before these breakouts, Chris mentioned our colleagues in OIIE are talking about free speech and hate bias. And that's just such an important piece to the entire puzzle of our campus. If you were on campus in the past semester or two, discussions around protests and free speech and harm, those are critical questions that aren't going away anytime soon. So offering or holding both perspectives is what we're asking you to think about in this session. And then another sample. Isn't it separatist to provide additional resources for only some groups and not others? Assume good intentions. It's really asking around. I want to point back to what Adrian talked about in terms of the difference between equity and equality. So a perception might be, if this org is getting this funding, but this org isn't, might that feel unfair? Well, if you're primarily focused on diversity and inclusion only, it could readily feel like that. If you also make that shift to think about equity and justice, think about another question such as, what are people on campus experiencing that they still don't feel safe when they're not, when separated from others like themselves? So the value of being in community. So many of our student orgs are really predicated on providing students a chance to feel like they belong in all the different parts, whether it's particular identities, whether it's interests. So again, it's not an either or, it's a consider holding both at the same time. So it's not just in the way you frame questions, it could also be in what you choose to prioritize or celebrate. So the last 2 or 3 shifts we want to run through with, move away from the question you ask to the things that you value. So for example, celebrating small growth, celebrating small increases in the numbers of minoritized groups means well if you're grounded in diversity and inclusion. What would it feel like and look like to also celebrate things like reductions in harm, revisions to systems that are abusive or exploitive, and ultimately things that we do on campus to increase support for more of our community? And the underlined section reminds us to remember that we actually reach out to listen to people's experiences and not assume we know what's best for them, even with the best of intentions. So again, that shift from just diversity and inclusion to also equity and justice can even shift the things that you as an individual member of an org or you as an entire org might choose to prioritize. And this could very well be either conscious or unconscious, and we can unpack that as we move on. A separate example on celebrating having a diverse e-board or a diverse slate of candidates in late spring when it's election time. That makes sense to celebrate when you prioritize solely diversity and inclusion. Another opportunity to also prioritize equity and justice would say, how might we celebrate removing the practices and the policies that were having the disparate impact on minoritized groups in the first place? So ultimately, this run through is about the shift of perspective. So we want to pause and see, then check in with y'all. We want to know what's clear, what's not. We offer this sort of series of slides to faculty and staff and students, and it usually takes time to sort of process. So we intentionally take a break. We want to get what questions. So we want to know what's making sense, what's not. So we welcome chat posts, we welcome Zoom hands, and we're curious to know what's running through your head at the moment. So If you're interested or willing, what did you take away from that last section, and what questions do you have for us? Malia, I see your hand.
Yeah, this is something that I've been having questions on. Because diversity and inclusion, like, it's something that's important to me. But since I run an organization that focuses primarily on supporting Black men and women, I've always had the question, like, what happens, and I don't know how likely this is to happen, but what happens if somebody of a different race decides that they want to try and join my organization? I don't know how to deal with that. Because I obviously cannot, deny them that, they to join my organization, but I don't know how to deal with that.
First, thanks for the great and honest question.
Yeah.
You're not alone in people. So remember, we are Towson University is a public institution. We're part of the USM. It's attached to the state of Maryland. So as a public institution, no part of our institution can discriminate. So, and we also support student orgs with particular interests. So it is complicated. I have I want to ask a couple things, and I want to see what Adrian's thinking. I want to know, everybody else who's here, are there other similar questions that people have had from their perspective, like from their orgs? Because it feels like from our perspective, it's a pretty common question, like, uh-oh. And we really appreciate, we hear a lot about it because students always want to be prepared in a good way. So I'm curious if other folks want to sort of also tag onto that question, because I want to make sure we spend a minute or two trying to wrestle with it. Adrian, what do you want to offer?
No, I mean, it's a question that you would be surprised how common it is, not just amongst other students, but I remember even when I was a student, that question sort of came up as, how do you sort of navigate through that? I think the first thing that comes to mind is making sure, like, you know what your mission is, and first and foremost, and making sure that that is readily available for everyone who's currently involved in your org and for people that are interested. But I think in terms of the initial introduction that you can often give to some of the students, like at Set It Off and other instances, language, I think, is going to be pretty important on how it gets presented to students, so that anyone who you interact with has a very clear idea of the very peculiar mission you have that you're trying to accomplish there. And that can get a little tricky based off of, us being a public university. But I think in my experience, most people have respected that when you at least try to engage them in a conversation on what you're trying to accomplish with your student org. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that helps. Yeah.
And this actually is a great segue to where we're going to finish up our session today. So I actually want to highlight the keynote speaker, James. He offered that takeaway question of, tell me more about that.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually going to end with this idea of being curious and being open. So picture you're having a weekly meeting and somebody new shows up, and they, either because they've shared or because of your org's mission attached to certain identities, it appears they don't fit who you expect in the org. So the same question of, like, why are you here? Think about it. What's the way to ask that question with the most affirming and gentle tone? Oh, why are you here? Versus the unconscious or conscious, wait, why are you here? Like, even the tone in the well-intended question. So where we're going to get to in our last section is to be thoughtful about ways you can stay curious in the most inviting and affirming way, rather than you wouldn't want your best of intentions to have a negative impact. So the intent impact is what we're going to get to in a couple of slides. So stay curious, and then we're going to do our last section of slides, and then we'll end up away from slides, which is faces. So let me share one more section, and then we will we'll end it with lots of discussion. So moving away from the shift from diversity and inclusion into equity and justice, some reminders, and this actually rings true for your question, Malia, and for other comments that we've had so far. As org members and org leaders, it's important to just acknowledge that sometimes discomfort happens. And our view is that that's not always a bad thing. If we are, as individuals and as orgs and groups, are willing to occasionally welcome what feels like discomfort, and you find a way to connect and work through it, that's where some new learning and what we think of as magic can happen. We also are asking you as current and aspiring org leaders to find ways to model and be willing to welcome risk and vulnerability. And ultimately, we're asking for bravery from you all as current and aspiring leaders. We've also moved away from this idea of safe space, because remember the slides on diversity that Adrian talked about. We are all diverse in so many ways. We want to also be pragmatic or realistic. It is not possible for any org to be perfectly, completely safe for everybody. We can pursue it constantly. We're always trying to pursue safer and safer and safer, but because of the reality of people are different and diversity is a thing. So instead of thinking that you can achieve a safe space for everyone, we want to shift it as keep pursuing it by being brave and being vulnerable and modeling that for all of your members of your org. So the last thing we talked about, I mentioned we want to get to this idea of intent and impact. We want to leave y'all with one last framework to be intentional with how you're showing up and interacting in your org. So we offer this this tool that has 3 parts. It's being mindful of what's happening in your head, what's happening in your heart, and ultimately, if you are more aware of those 2 parts to you, what will you do differently? So it's head, heart, and action. So we've already invited some folks with this next prompt that we had ready. It was, think about a recent time where things were challenging or uncomfortable, and we can broaden the question. So we ask you to think about your response in terms of what happened, in terms of how your brain processes. Like, this thing happened, this behavior. The other way to answer what happened is, oh, there were feelings. I felt confused, scared, guilty. So the head and the heart piece is another tool we want to add into your tool bag. Just occasionally reflecting or being mindful of what a head response could be to an impetus, or what a heart response could be to an impetus or to a stimulus. So we've been talking around this idea of inclusive orgs also have a common foundation around understanding a definition of civility, but that is attached to the idea of belonging that Adrian started us off today. When you intersect DE and I, you have belonging. So civility, as one of your takeaway slides, is useful as a concept. We stress it and we use it as a slide to say that you don't want to assume that everyone has the same working definition of that concept. Oops, let me go back. Then the other tool we want to mark is when you're welcoming vulnerability and bravery, we want to offer a different way to think about this idea of disagreements or calling out. We regularly hear a lot about calling out and cancel culture, and we want to offer a reframe into thinking about it as, instead of calling out, to inviting one of your colleagues into more vulnerability, inviting into more honesty. So even how you talk about it, we want to encourage you to reframe, particularly when things get challenging. When things get challenging, and I just want to do a quick run through of these slides, and we want to save the last few minutes for your questions. This is why we have the QR code, so you can take the slides with you, because we always hope that there's time for discussions, and we may not get to every single slide. We want to offer a preview of a program at TU called Dialogue at TU. It offers some training and skills on how to navigate uncomfortable situations, how to stay curious, and we had been focused on, for gosh, more than 5 years, on always being ready to train faculty and staff. And this year we're starting to pilot offering the skills training to students. So there's going to be a slide at the end if you're interested in learning more or potentially going through a pilot training. Dialogue in itself, really quickly, it asks you to think about there are different types of interactions. None of them are good or bad. It's depending on your goal, what is the appropriate way to interact or communicate. So there's a difference between, and we're going to quickly run through this this flyer from the bottom up. Clearly a debate, the goal is to win. You often win by making less of the other view or even the other person. Now TU, you may know, has had a wonderful history of a nationally award-winning competitive debate team. So depending on your goal, you might want to engage in debate. You might also not want to debate, but a discussion where every member of the org has a chance to be heard. That's also, depending on certain goals, valuable. If instead you're trying to understand people, learn more about them, the goal might be just a dialogue. You may not get to a conclusion, you will probably get to more curiosity. So depending on your goal, there are different types of communication. But ultimately, we do the intro to this skill called dialogue because when groups spend time practicing dialogue, here's where some magic happens. They learn more about each other. They learn more skills on how to challenge in respectful ways. They learn different and deeper ways to work together. And we offer it as another tool. And if you're trying to practice dialogue, you have to learn and spend a lot of time practicing this concept of intent and impact. You may have the best of intentions, but what happens when the impact unintentionally is much more negative. So the one panel cartoon, it says, "I didn't mean to run over your foot. I am a good driver." It creates this artificial sort of argument. What we're inviting you, particularly as student leaders, to do is to be willing to reflect on how will you authentically respond when your intent doesn't match the impact, and what is a way to do it quickly, appropriately, and authentically. So I want to bring it back to James's question. There's a way to ask, tell me more, where you authentically want to listen and you're going to. And there's a way to ask, tell me more, where you're half interested, you're not paying attention. So I want to kind of end it on this intent impact slide, but we want to come out of our slides and tackle any takeaway thoughts, last questions, and then I'm gonna share the slide with the QR code so you can take away the slide. So we have a minute or two before we'll show you the QR code. We're interested in lingering questions, takeaways. We'd love either in the chat or coming off mic to talk to us about what you thought about any of our discussion today.
And they can also be questions related to scenarios that you had previously gone through or scenarios that you're expecting will at least show up at some point in the year. Again, we're here to help in the last few minutes that we have with you.
I had a question. I'm like, how do you do with cliques? Because like there be like, even though it's a group and like overall, you know, we're supposed to be together and it's supposed to be like a family atmosphere and stuff like that. And within that family, there's cliques. And then if you don't fit into a certain clique, like me personally, I don't fit into a certain clique, but I'm one of the leaders of the organization. So it's like, not that I'm trying to fit into one, but more so trying to like, not break them up, but break them up. Cause it's like, you don't want to go to a place that you're supposed to feel comfortable and then feel like an outsider. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So before I answer that, thank you for your question. Is your name, is it pronounced Vesta?
Yeah, Vesta.
Vesta. So are you referring to a particular student org?
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to name it. I just was wondering if we're trying to understand, like, are we noticing cliques like when you all have like social gatherings or events or programs? Is that sort of the area where you're starting to see some issues there?
I feel like yes, like it's more noticeable in the social gatherings, but like even like during practice, because we're yeah, during practice, we'll be doing what we're doing or whatever. But then even in the midst, like, like if it's like a sports club or something like that, like you'll have activities to do. But then like when you're not doing activities or whatever, like, you're talking to your friends, like the people that you usually bond with the most. But it's like if you don't really bond with nobody, and it's like no one, I don't know, when everyone like acknowledges the clique. They know the cliques are there, but it's like no one's really doing anything about it. So it's like the people that don't really fit into a certain clique, it's like they're not ostracized, but like, yeah, people just kind of look at them differently.
Hmm.
So it's like me trying to work on myself and going back, like, I don't need to, like, I feel like sometimes I'm in high school over again, like, I don't need to fit into a certain clique. Like, I became a leader in this organization to prevent stuff like this. So it's like now, because when I started, like, I wasn't a leader, and like everybody had their cliques, but me, I'm the type of person, I don't fit into just one thing, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's different type of friend groups that I interact with. So yeah, I can interact with every single one of them, but it's like it's not somebody that I leave practice and I can call like, oh, like this is what happened in my life, da 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 da. Like no one's calling to check on me or nothing like that. So it's like harder for me to get out of my comfort zone more, to reach out, even though I don't really fit into a place that I'm supposed to fit in the most.
That's
Yeah.
I want to briefly say, and then I'll have Adrian wrap while you should slip. One of my answers to a lot of common questions that we get, it's a kind of a series of two things. It's complicated, which means it's rarely ever one or the other. It's both. So
Yeah.
I heard you talk about being a leader and what you had to get there. I'm getting a lot of confidence from you as a leader. So I'm going to invite you to find ways to model the behavior you're hoping for. So my short takeaway is, what can you do to avoid the assumption that students have to choose either you want your clique or you want to be active in the org? So are there ways to just acknowledge that everyone has many different relationships? It's complicated, but what's the shared commitment that when you're in this org meeting or projects or events or practices, what kind of group commitment or norm can everyone agree to say, when we're on the org, we want to focus on the org, all the other relationships that everyone else has in their own lives, put them on pause. Like, it's sort of not, you wouldn't want it to come across as, oh, we're being told we can't have other friends because when we're in this org. That's not what you're saying. I hear you saying, to be able to get to that sort of role as a leader, you've had to wrestle with managing multiple relationships. Sometimes cliques are for comfort. So are folks not finding more comfort in the org? So there's a deeper level. I want to kind of mark it as, it's never about there's only one way to do it. It's holding many things at once. Does any of that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
So I'm gonna pass it over to Adrian while I share the slide that shows you how to get all the slides that we did.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I want to just sort of briefly answer. I know a couple of you all have to probably head to another session. To just tag on some of the things that Brian has said, I think what's also been super helpful for someone that is an introvert, and so sometimes it can be harder to get fully engaged and create new friendships. Being in that position of leadership, it always helps to, not always, where, as Brian said, you just sort of hold the opportunity away from those close friendships to continue to grow, but rather, are there occasional moments where we can implement some engagement, some activities that promote getting to know some of the other people in your student org? And I know like that can sometimes be like super uncomfortable because you're having to sort of be vulnerable with someone new, but the long-term effects always work out. I never like those games where they're like, go find someone that you don't know. But at the end, I always find a new appreciation for that because the connection is sort of built there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Could I get your email or your contact information possibly?
Yeah. I'm gonna
I
put that.
can, and I will make it easy. It's actually in the slide before the QR code. So if
Oh,
you use the QR code, you've got our emails built into one of the slides.
thank you so much.
Oh, thank you all. If you need to get to the next session, I'm going to stop the recording. The slides have more than what we were able to get to. You have our email. Please do follow up with questions, or if you need other things from our team. Thanks, everybody.